Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and contains spoilers. Well, it's Halloween week 2019, which means it's been exactly 5 years since Wirt and Greg began their journey into the unknown in Over the Garden Wall, a miniseries that ran only 10 very short episodes on Cartoon Network back in 2014. And I gotta say, it's kind of a miracle that this show exists as it does. Some comic books I still need to check out aside, there's something almost shocking about how self-contained it is. It didn't run for years, get a theatrical movie, or get turned into some CG abomination by Blue Sky Studios or something. It just is. It continues to exist almost entirely as this one nearly perfect and weird object. And in the almost entirely brand-driven world of modern entertainment, there's something pretty amazing about that. It's only been 5 years, but I have a suspicion that the series will continue to stand the test of time in a big way. Not just because I like it, though that obviously doesn't hurt, but because it draws from so many different influences all at once, in a way that helps it create a world and tone that feel completely unique. I didn't pay much attention to the show when it first premiered, mostly because I kept hearing it was like Cartoon Network's attempt at mimicking the Tim Burton style, which sounded pretty stale to me. But once I got around to, actually seeing it, I really didn't think there was much of a connection at all. Tim Burton's style is very reflective of old Vincent Price gothic horror movies, infused with the 60s California suburbia he grew up in. Garden Wall is a totally different beast. Pun intended, I guess. As much as I love characters like Greg, Wirt, Beatrice, and of course Jason Funderburker.
Jason Funderburker?
I've always considered that land of the unknown to be the real star of the show. It somehow manages to feel otherworldly and completely familiar all at once. The show's creator, Patrick McHale, has talked a lot about how he took inspiration from old New England postcards, and that shines through, as the autumn of the show feels comfortable and idealized. There's a darkness and evil in the unknown, but there's a lot of warmth and brightness too, making it really feel like a place you'd want to get lost in, filled with both adventure and peril. Now, some of that could describe a fantasy land like Middle-earth as well, but even there, I think the show feels very different. Tolkien, and so many of the writers that followed in his footsteps, are very invested in the logical explanation of the worlds that they create. I mean, pick up a copy of The Return of the King right now, and you'll find the last fourth of it is a collection of appendices, family trees, and more supplemental material to fill out all the little details of the author's fantasy landscape. And it works well for what people like Tolkien are trying to achieve. But Over the Garden Wall feels like it's continuing a much older storytelling tradition. It's like a natural extension of the Brothers Grimm's collection of folktales. Or, and this may be a little reach here, even ancient stories like the Odyssey. Just this idea of characters finding themselves in fantastical situations that they can barely understand, and the story itself being perfectly okay with leaving those details to your imagination. Over the Garden Wall has created a community that loves to try to decode what the ending means and separate what's real and what isn't. And I think that's part of a larger obsession with fan theories, plot consistency, and logic that fuels a ton of online discussion around art, especially on YouTube. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that, like I do think it can be a lot of fun in the right context, but I kind of don't think that's what really matters here. Don't get me wrong, it's clear that the producers of the show have a lot of this detail mapped out in their heads, but they play things very close to the chest, and the show is all the better for it. Things like the backstory of Auntie Whispers or the costumed skeleton town of Pottersfield aren't spelled out almost at all, and we get the sense that what we're seeing is only the tip of the iceberg. One small part of the massive tapestry that this world has to offer. And that's exciting. It makes the show feel vivid and lived in a way that many fantasy worlds just don't. But the thing that most brings to mind old Folklore to me is the way that the show uses horror. On the whole, Over the Garden Wall is a very kid-friendly show. In fact, in one of the most funny and meta scenes of the series, the show makes it very clear that a bunch of teenagers are going into the woods to drink age-appropriate drinks, not anything illegal.
Like the juice?
But one area where it feels a little more grown up is in the show's scarier moments. When you go back and reread Brothers Grimm stuff like Hansel and Gretel in their old-fashioned form, you really notice how creepy it is and how much it leaves to the imagination. Over the Garden Wall happily keeps that tradition alive. A good example is the old witch Adelaide telling Wirt and Greg that she's gonna fill their heads with wool so that they'll follow her every command. That's one of those great little lines that says a horrifying amount with so little. Like, how would she do that? How does it work? Is it just their brain, or would they have an entire head made of wool? These are exactly the kind of spooky questions that really stick with you when you're a kid hearing old fairy tales. And I'm guessing they stuck with the kids who watched this episode too. Where this creepy, minimalist approach to horror really works best is in the show's main antagonist, the Beast. And man, I could just talk about the Woodsman and the Beast for this whole thing because they're so interesting and mysterious. I think we see one clear shot of the Beast in the whole show, when Wirt and the Woodsman finally fight back against him in the final episode. And what we see is this horrible and honestly kind of feeble looking creature with faces all over his body. You could spin a million theories about exactly what he is and why he demands children be turned into trees, and people on the internet have been more than happy to come up with them. But to me, one of the best things about this show is that answer is beside the point. We uncover the villain and see that he's nothing but a sad leech, someone who needs the Woodsman far more than the Woodsman ever needed him. So much of the rest beyond that remains unknown, another secret the show keeps to itself. And honestly, I'm more than happy to leave it as one. The fact that so much wonder and mystery remain in the show's mythology is one of my favorite things the show does.
Who are you? We're burglars!
No, we're not. We just needed to get out of the rain,
So we came here to burgle your turts.
No,
One of the series' best episodes, Songs of the Dark Lantern, sees Wirt and Greg wander into a tavern where everyone is obsessed with singing songs and identifying exactly what everyone's role in life is. The tavern keeper is a tavern keeper, the tailor is a tailor, and so on. At first, they're all annoyed and confused that they don't know what Wirt's role is, but after a few false starts, they land on the idea that he's a pilgrim, a traveler on a sacred journey, in their words. This is another idea that helps connect the series to older stories and especially old folktales. I love that in most episodes, the cast just wanders into an entirely new society, with its own rules and customs that we can barely understand. Not only does it give every episode its own unique identity, something that a lot of shows don't bother to do these days, it's a great way to make it feel like these characters are really deep in the unknown. There's no time for anything to feel familiar like the settings of other cartoons, because the characters are always on a journey, on their way to find the next weird group of leisurely frog people or school that teaches animals how to read and write. This may not be a recipe for a good long-running show, which may hit diminishing returns after a while without a story engine like Bikini Bottom. But for a miniseries like Over the Garden Wall, I think it's the perfect way to make things continue to feel odd and interesting from the first episode to the last.
Candy camouflage!
But if the world of the unknown is the show's greatest achievement, its most endearing element is probably the characters. Greg and Wirt seem very one-dimensional when we first meet them. The energetic kid who always leaps before he looks, and the constantly worrying straight man who'd be scared of his own shadow. It's a pretty classic comedy dynamic, dating back to like the silent era of movies. But over the course of the show, Over the Garden Wall really works to deepen them, especially Wirt. I love how they handle his origin in episode 9, where we see him terrified to ask out a girl named Sarah from his school, only to freak out even more when he finds out the famous Jason Funderburker plans to ask her out too. Like most people probably, I was expecting this to go the obvious route, with Jason as some popular jock type and Sarah as a stereotypical cheerleader. And the show actually leans into that assumption by having Wirt run to meet her at a football game. But then the show pulls the rug out from under us in a really fun way. Sarah isn't some 90s movie-style cheerleader, and Jason definitely isn't some beloved quarterback. But the biggest revelation of all is that all these people like Wirt, especially Sarah. He's only the hated nerd and Jason is only the popular ladies' man in his own head. He's just too neurotic to realize that he needs to get out of his own way. Now, that smart bit of storytelling raises Wirt and his friends beyond the boring cliche that most cartoons would have been more than happy to settle for. But where Wirt is constantly worrying about what others think, Greg's journey is about having to consider other people's thoughts and feelings, kind of for the first time. Now don't get me wrong, he's a likable kid, but he's also pure impulse, like most kids are, and his choices early on in the show are really just based on what he feels like doing at any given moment. That all changes in what might be the show's boldest episode, Babes in the Wood, where Greg enters a surreal dreamscape inspired by old 30s and 40s animation and makes a deal with the Beast to save Wirt's life. At the beginning of the episode, Wirt had lashed out at him, telling him the fact that they got lost in the first place was all his fault. But Greg doesn't cry about it. In fact, he immediately tries to take responsibility in whatever way he can by going with the Beast, even if he's clearly not old enough yet to see that the Beast is tricking him. Still, it's a brave and selfless choice, and one that I couldn't see him making at the beginning of the series. And then there's probably my favorite lead character, Beatrice. When Beatrice was first introduced, I liked her, but I thought she was a pretty predictable spin on an old fantasy trope. Like, instead of the animal friend and guide being peppy and helpful, she's really sarcastic and mean. Fun, but not really any more clever than something you'd find in a Shrek movie. But when you rewatch the show, her dismissive quips take on a sadder, more sinister light, as she's clearly trying to keep herself from getting too attached to Wirt or Greg at all, since that would only make it harder to lead them to their woolly doom. By the end of this really short season, she's undergone an impressive character arc. But even in those early episodes, her role as the cynical jerk of the group is really important. I think it adds even more to the Greg and Wirt dynamic, and it gives the show some of its best lines. By the time all is said and done, I gotta say, I think Over the Garden Wall will go down as one of the greatest achievements in animation this decade. Its blend of childlike wonder and older, more adult themes combine to create a world that I just love going back to. I mean, it's a show with a singing frog, but that singing frog is voiced by Tom Waits. There's really just nothing else like that. So many animated shows seem intent on being as loud and over-caffeinated as possible, and while Greg definitely has some of that energy, overall the show is a little more melancholy and thoughtful than that. The character designs are simple and fun, but the world around them is an amazing mix of gorgeous fall colors and old-fashioned Americana, which I think really makes Over the Garden Wall the ultimate Halloween show.
Oh, potatoes and molasses. They're so much sweeter than algebra class if you...
Even though I like how small and self-contained the show is, I'm a little shocked they didn't do more toy tie-ins. And if you're the kind of person who desperately wishes you could get your hands on a LEGO Over the Garden Wall set, I definitely recommend The Secret World of LEGO, which dives deep into the company's history and design philosophy on Curiosity Stream. It's a streaming service from the founder of the Discovery Channel that has thousands of titles to choose from big budget documentaries about science, history, tech, and tons of other stuff too. But now when you sign up, you'll get even more. By signing up for Curiosity Stream's annual membership, you're also receiving Nebula, a great new streaming service made by independent creators like Lindsay Ellis, CGP Grey, Just Right, and me. It's a way for YouTubers to go beyond the demands of YouTube's algorithms and create something new. So you can support a lot of independent creators and get a bunch of high quality documentaries just by signing up for an annual membership for only $19.99 for an entire year. So to get access to all of that and a free trial, go to curiositystream.com/captainmidnight, which you'll find in the description and pinned comment below.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes, too.